The Duke's borrowed name. The rain had been falling since noon, and by the time Clara Ashdown left the milliner's on Candle Street, it had settled into the kind of steady gray drizzle that made the whole city look like it was being erased. She stood under the shop's narrow awning, waiting for it to ease, and that was how she came to see him. He was crossing the street with an armful of proof sheets wrapped in oilcloth, moving carefully to keep the ink dry, when an old man ahead of him slipped on the wet cobbles and went down hard, his basket of books scattering into the gutter. Most people stepped around him. A cart driver shouted at him to mind the road. The man with the proof sheets did not step around him. He knelt, right there in the filthy water, and began gathering the books one by one, wiping each cover against his own coat before he set it back in the basket. He did it without hurry, the way a man does something he has decided is worth doing properly or not at all. When the old bookseller tried to press a coin into his hand for his trouble, he closed the man's fingers back over it and shook his head, and then he was gone, into the print shop on the corner, and the moment closed over like water. Clara stood under the awning a long while after the rain stopped. She did not know his name. She knew only that in a city that had spent 3 London seasons teaching her exactly what a person was worth, a dowry, a face, a family's outstanding debts, she had just watched a stranger behave as though worth had nothing to do with any of that at all. She thought of him again that evening, unbidden, while her mother recited the guest list for the Farringdon ball as though it were scripture. She thought of him the next morning, buttering toast she did not eat. It was a foolish, indulgent little secret, the kind of thing a girl was permitted to carry for exactly as long as her real life allowed her to ignore it. Her real life allowed her 3 days. The summons came the way all her mother's verdicts were delivered, without a knock. "It's settled," Mrs. Ashdown said, sweeping into Clara's room with the particular brightness she wore when she had done something dreadful and meant to call it good news. "Lord Pelham has agreed to clear your father's debts. All of them. The mill, the notes, everything. In exchange," she paused, as if building toward a gift, "you'll marry him by month's end." Clara set down her book very carefully, the way one sets down something breakable when one's hands have started to shake. "I won't." "You will." Her mother's voice did not rise. It never needed to. It simply hardened, the way water hardens into ice without changing its shape. "Your father is one bad harvest from debtor's prison, Clara. Pelham is offering to save this family, and all he asks in return is a wife who can pour tea and hold her tongue. You are 23. You will not have a better offer, and we both know it." "He is cruel to his dogs," Clara said. "What do you imagine he'll be to a wife?" Her mother's mouth thinned. "You will learn to manage him." "I would rather manage poverty." The slap was quick, almost businesslike, as though her mother had been saving the gesture for exactly this sentence. Clara's cheek burned. She did not cry. She had learned years ago that tears were simply another currency her mother knew how to spend, and she held her mother's gaze until Mrs. Ashdown turned and left, locking the door out of habit more than strategy, because habit was all her mother had left. Clara sat very still in the ringing silence, listening to her own pulse in her ears. She thought of Lord Pelham's damp hands at the Farringdon ball, the way his eyes moved over a room totting up its contents like a man doing sums. She thought of her father's ledgers, red-inked and hopeless, and of her younger sister Meg, 12 years old, and watching this whole performance from the schoolroom stairs, with the particular helpless fear of a child who understands, dimly, that her future is being decided by other people's arithmetic. And then, unbidden, she thought of a stranger, kneeling in gutter water to save an old man's books, asking nothing, expecting nothing, already forgotten by everyone in the street except her. She did not know his name. She knew the street. That, for the moment, was enough. It took her 2 days and a pair of pearl earbobs, traded quietly to a maid with a talent for discretion, to learn what she needed. Candle Street was narrower in daylight than it had seemed through rain, the buildings leaning toward each other like gossiping neighbors. The shop had brass letters over the door, half of them tarnished: T. Winter, printer and bookbinder. She stood outside it for a long moment, rehearsing words that dissolved the instant she reached for them, and then made herself go in before her courage could finish failing her. He looked up when the bell rang, and she saw him properly for the first time, not through rain and distance, but across a counter stacked with type cases and drying proofs. He was younger than she'd assumed, perhaps 30, with dark hair pushed back carelessly, and ink staining the side of one hand like a permanent bruise. His eyes were a startling clear brown, the color of strong tea held up to the light, and they went from polite indifference to plain wariness the moment they took in her clothes. "Can I help you, miss?" "Mr. Winter?" "Depends who's asking. My name is Clara Ashdown." She made herself say the rest before her nerve failed her a second time. "I saw you 2 days ago, in the rain, the old man's books." Something flickered behind the wariness. Not warmth, exactly. Recognition that she'd seen something he hadn't meant to be seen doing. That's not really a matter for conversation. "I have a proposal for you." She heard how mad it sounded, even as she said it, and pressed on before she could stop herself. "A marriage, a business arrangement, nothing more. I am being sold to a man I despise to settle my father's debts, and I would rather belong to a stranger of my own choosing than a monster of my mother's." The shop was very quiet. Somewhere in the back, a press creaked as an apprentice worked it, and a boy of perhaps 14 leaned around the doorframe to stare at her before a look from Thomas sent him back to his work. "You're mad," Thomas said finally, not unkindly. "Very possibly." She set a small pouch on the counter between them. "There's £30. It's what I have. It's yours, whatever you decide, for the trouble of hearing me out." He looked at the pouch a long moment, and she watched him do the same silent arithmetic she'd seen in Pelham's eyes at the ball. Except where Pelham's calculations had made her feel like a ledger entry, this man seemed to be working out something else entirely, some private sum that had nothing to do with the money at all. "Why me?" he said. "You don't know me. I know you knelt in the street for a man who couldn't pay you back." Her voice caught, and she let it. "That's more than I know about anyone else in my life." He was quiet long enough that she thought she'd lost. He glanced once toward the back of the shop, where the apprentice was very obviously not listening, and then back at her, and something in his face shifted, some decision arriving that she couldn't read the shape of. "There would be conditions," he said. Relief went through her so fast it was almost pain. "Anything. This is a transaction. You will not be my wife in any true sense, nor I your husband. We will share a name and nothing else." His eyes held hers, steady, testing. "And you will live as I live. No carriages. No servants. If you cannot bear that, walk out now, and no harm done." She thought of the gilded rooms she'd grown up in, every one of them a cage dressed as a drawing room. "I can bear it. Then we understand each other." He did not smile. "Let's find a vicar." They were married 3 days later, in a small parish church, that smelled of damp stone, with the verger and a passing chandler standing witness because no one else had been asked. The ring was plain iron, bought from a stall for 4 pence, and it sat strange and cold on her finger. When the vicar pronounced them man and wife, Thomas did not kiss her. He simply nodded, once, as though confirming a delivery had arrived intact, and they walked back to Candle Street separately, a yard of pavement between them the whole way. His rooms above the print shop were small, a sitting room with 2 chairs and a cold grate. A narrow bedroom she was given, and he was not. He slept on a pallet by the press downstairs, he told her, and did not discuss it further. What surprised her were the books, not the ledgers and pattern books of his trade, but a shelf of worn volumes. Donne, a battered Aristotle, something in French she couldn't place. Read so often their spines had gone soft as cloth. The first days were a study in silence, broken only by small domestic failures. She had never cooked in her life, and the shop's landlady below, a broad, kind-faced widow named Mrs. Pearl, took pity on her within the week, teaching her how to stretch a shilling's worth of mutton into 3 days of stew, and how to keep a fire from either dying or devouring itself. Clara learned the rhythms of the street, the way she had once learned the rhythms of a ballroom, which doors opened onto kindness, which onto trouble, which windows held a fiddler who played sad tunes after dark. "You read Greek," she said. The first evening, the silence between them had stretched past comfort into something like a dare. Badly. He didn't look up from the proof he was correcting. It gives the evening's shape. She learned him the way one learns a language with no grammar book, by watching. He left a saucer of milk on the back step each night for a cat that never quite trusted him enough to be seen taking it. He corrected his apprentice's mistakes without ever raising his voice, the boy flushing with the shame of disappointing someone patient rather than someone harsh. He ate whatever she managed to cook, including the first week's several genuine failures, without complaint, and once, when she'd burned a stew to a black ruin, she caught the corner of his mouth twitch before he schooled it back to stillness. "You may laugh," she said, mortified. "I would, in your place." "I'm not laughing." The corner of his mouth twitched again. "I am admiring your commitment to ruining perfectly good mutton." It was, she realized later, lying awake and turning the moment over, the first time he had said anything to her that wasn't strictly necessary. She held on to it the way she'd once held on to the memory of him kneeling in the rain, a small, warm thing, entirely hers. He was, she began to understand, a man built almost entirely of restraint, and she found herself absurdly curious what he might be if the restraint ever slipped. It slipped, the first time, on a Tuesday, nearly a fortnight into their strange marriage. He came home late, his jaw tight in a way she'd learned to read as trouble, and did not take off his coat before he spoke. "We're leaving London," he said, without preamble. "Leaving. Where?" "North. There are people looking for you. Your mother, and Pelham besides. He's a more dangerous man than you know him to be. He's petitioning to have the marriage annulled on grounds you were coerced." His eyes met hers, and for once there was something raw in them, some fear he wasn't troubling to hide. "I should have thought of this before I let you walk in here. I chose this," she said. "I chose you." The words hung there, more naked than she'd intended. Something in his face changed, not quite softened, but shifted, like a door easing off a stuck hinge. "I know," he said, "but knowing won't stop them. We leave at dawn." That night she lay awake in the narrow bed, listening to the small sounds of him below. the shift of the palette, the occasional turn of a page, the particular quiet of a man who did not sleep easily, even when the day's danger was still hours off. She thought, not for the first time, that she had married a puzzle with no promise of a solution, and that she had somehow stopped minding. They left as they had married, quietly, without ceremony, but this time a plain traveling coach was waiting at the corner, hired, he said, by a friend, in a tone that discouraged further asking. The coach was better sprung than anything a printer's wages could explain, and Clara noted it, and said nothing, filing it away with the Greek and the restraint and all the other things about her husband that did not quite add up. The journey north took 2 days. On the first he was almost talkative, pointing out a ruined abbey from the window, naming the birds that startled up from the hedgerows, as though the further they got from London, the more of himself he was willing to spend. On the second, he grew stranger, not colder, but more distant, as though he were watching some other, older road unspool behind his eyes, one that had nothing to do with the hedgerows at all. "You've been here before," she said, somewhere past midday, watching him watch the passing country with an expression she couldn't place. "Once," he said, "a long time ago, I didn't think I'd come back." She did not press him. She was beginning to understand that his silences were not refusals, only doors she had not yet been given the key to, and that demanding entry would only make him lock them harder. They stopped to change horses at a coaching inn just past midday, a low, smoke-stained building with a yard full of mud and shouting ostlers. Julian handed her down and went to arrange fresh horses, and Clara stood near the doorway, glad of the chance to stretch her legs, when a stout, red-faced gentleman, coming out of the tap room, stopped dead at the sight of him. "Wrexham?" the man said, too loud, his eyebrows climbing toward his hairline. "Good God." "Wrexham, is that you, man? We'd all but buried you. Fanshawe swore he saw you in Calais. Ridley was certain you'd gone to India." Julian's whole body went very still, the way a hare goes still when a hawk's shadow crosses the field. "You're mistaken, sir," he said, his voice flat and final. "My name is Winter." The gentleman blinked, plainly unconvinced, his gaze flicking to Clara and back. "Winter, of course. My apologies. A very great resemblance, that's all. Quite uncanny." He tipped his hat, still frowning, and retreated toward his own carriage with the particular haste of a man who suspected he'd blundered into something, but couldn't say what. Julian did not relax until the man's carriage had rattled out of the yard. Clara watched him standing there, jaw tight, hands not quite steady, and understood for the first time just how thin the ice was that he'd been walking on for 2 years, how one drunk acquaintance in a coaching yard could have ended the whole careful architecture of his disappearance. "Who was that?" she asked quietly, once they were back inside the coach and moving. "Lord Fanshawe's brother-in-law. We were at Oxford together." He was still watching the window, though there was nothing to see now but hedgerow. "I used to think, if anyone ever recognized me, I'd feel relief. 2 years of hiding, and I thought some part of me wanted to be caught." He shook his head slowly. "I didn't feel relief. I felt as though the ground had opened." "Because of the title," Clara said. "Or because of me." He looked at her then, something startled crossing his face, as though she'd asked a question he hadn't yet let himself ask. "I don't entirely know anymore," he admitted. "I think that frightens me more than the title does." Neither of them spoke again for a long while, but she noticed, somewhere past the next milestone, that his hand had found its way to the seat beside hers, close enough to touch, not quite touching, as though he were testing how much closer he was permitted to come. On the evening of the second day, the coach turned off the public road onto a private drive lined with ancient elms, and Clara's confusion sharpened into alarm. "Thomas, where are we going?" He didn't answer at first. He was looking out the window with the fixed, braced expression of a man walking towards something he'd spent 2 years running from. "Thomas, that's not my name," he said quietly. "It was never my name. I am sorry, Clara. I should have told you before we ever reached the church, and I told myself there would be time, and there wasn't, and now there isn't any more road left to put it off with." The house, when it came into view past the trees, was not a cottage. It was pale gray stone under a darkening sky, wings spreading on either side of a lit doorway, a house with the particular gravity of somewhere that had stood for centuries and intended to stand for centuries more. Servants were already assembling at the entrance before the coach had fully stopped, their faces caught between disbelief and something closer to grief turned suddenly to relief. An elderly man in a steward's coat stepped forward first and stopped dead when he saw who climbed down from the coach. "Your Grace," his voice cracked on it. "Your Grace, we'd feared the worst these 2 years." Clara went very still. "Hargreave," Thomas said, except it wasn't Thomas's voice exactly. It had dropped into something quieter and more absolute, a voice used to being obeyed without needing to raise itself. "I'm well. This is my wife, the Duchess." "Your Grace, the Duchess." Clara turned to look at him and saw, for the first time, not a bookbinder but a stranger wearing a bookbinder's coat, the same face, entirely rearranged by the weight suddenly settling back onto it. "You lied to me," she said, very low, so only he could hear. "The lie," he said heavily, "was Thomas Winter. I'm sorry. There wasn't a version of the truth I knew how to give you that didn't cost me everything I'd built to survive." His name, she learned that night in a library 2 stories tall and smelling of beeswax and old paper, was Julian Ashford, 9th Duke of Wrexham. 2 years before, a carriage accident on an icy road had killed his father and his younger brother and left Julian, driving, entirely unhurt. He had inherited a title, an estate, and a guilt so total it had no proper shape, because there had been nothing he could have done differently. The coroner's inquiry had said so plainly, and it had not helped at all. He had walked away from Ashford Grange within the month, changed his name to his mother's maiden one, and gone to ground in a trade that let him set other men's words instead of living inside the wreckage of his own. "You didn't run from the title," Clara said, understanding arriving slow and complete. "You ran from the accident. The title was just what you had to give up to do it." He looked at her with something unguarded and startled, as though she'd found a door in a wall he'd thought was solid stone. "Yes," he said. "No one's put it that plainly before." "I'm not asking you to feel differently about it," she said. "I only wanted you to know I saw it." He did not answer that, but he did not look away either, and something in the silence between them stopped being uncomfortable and started being, instead, a kind of company. "The house has been waiting," he said finally, almost to himself. 2 years, and it's still waiting. I can feel it. Then, perhaps it's time it stopped." "That is easier said, Your Grace." He said the title with a wry, exhausted edge, testing it on her, the way a man tests a wound to see how much it still hurts. "I've had 2 years of practice at running, none whatsoever at staying." "Then we'll both be beginners," Clara said, "at something." The days that followed had the strange, suspended quality of a held breath. Clara was given the Duchess's rooms, untouched, she gathered, since a mother long dead. She was assigned a lady's maid, a shy girl named Susan, who curtsied so low the first morning that Clara had to physically stop her from apologizing for existing, and she found, to her own surprise, that she missed Mrs. Pearl's stew and the particular closeness of 2 rooms above a print shop more than she missed anything about her old life in London. The staff, she quickly understood, did not know what to make of her. She was not born to this life, and everyone from the housekeeper to the lowest scullery maid seemed to sense it in the way she still asked rather than instructed, still thanked footmen for tasks a duchess was meant to take entirely for granted. Mrs. Whitlock, the housekeeper, a tall woman with the bearing of a career soldier, watched her for the first several days with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. Until, on the 5th morning, she found Clara in the still room, attempting, badly, to mend a torn hem herself rather than ring for Susan. "That is not a duchess's work, Your Grace," Mrs. Whitlock said, not unkindly, taking the needle from her hand with the brisk efficiency of long practice. "It was a printer's wife's work, a fortnight ago," Clara said. "I confess I'm still learning which parts of myself I'm meant to leave behind." Something in Mrs. Whitlock's face eased, fractionally. "His Grace looks at you the way he used to look at his brother's star charts," she said, folding the mended hem with more care than the task required, "as though there's something there worth working out. I've not seen that look on him in 2 years. Whatever else you are, Your Grace, you've brought that back with you, and this house is grateful for it, whether it says so or not." It was the closest thing to a welcome Clara had received since Hargreaves' stunned bow in the drive, and she carried it with her the rest of the day like a small, warm coal. A week after their arrival, Lady Cornelia, Julian's aunt, a small, formidable woman, with her nephew's same clear eyes, descended on the Grange with a maid, 3 trunks, and the settled expression of a woman arriving to fix something. "So," she said, over tea, subjecting Clara to a study so thorough it felt like being catalogued, "you are the girl who married my nephew in a back-alley church, thinking him a printer. I am, Your Ladyship. Don't apologize for it. I've never met a printer in my life who'd have knelt in the gutter for a stranger's books, and I've met a great many printers." Lady Cornelia's mouth curved, not quite a smile. "That was always Julian, underneath everything. My brother tried very hard to breed it out of him. I'm relieved to see he didn't entirely succeed." She set down her cup with a decisive click. "He hasn't opened the observatory since Edmund died. My great-nephew was mad for the stars, you understand. Used to drag Julian up there every clear night of his life, badgering him about comets. Now the dome doesn't turn. No one's asked why, because everyone's too afraid of the answer." Clara went up the following afternoon, alone, and found the observatory thick with dust, the great brass telescope shrouded under a canvas gone stiff with disuse, star charts curling at the edges on a desk no one had touched in 2 years. She did not touch the telescope. She simply opened the shutters, letting late sun spill across the floor for the first time since the accident, and began, methodically, to sweep. Julian found her there at dusk, and stood in the doorway a long moment before he spoke. "What are you doing?" It needed doing. She didn't look up from the broom. Grief keeps a room dark long after the morning's finished, if someone doesn't open the shutters eventually. Edmund used to sit exactly there. He nodded at a worn cushion by the eyepiece, his voice gone rough. He'd catalog every star he could find and lecture me about all of them whether I asked or not. Then, perhaps he'd rather the dome kept turning than kept still. He didn't answer, but the next clear night, she heard the dome groan its way around on its rusted gears for the first time in 2 years, and did not go up to see, because some things a man needs to do alone first, before he can bear to share them again. He came to find her afterward, in the small parlor where she'd taken to sitting with a book she rarely read more than a page of before her mind wandered. He didn't speak. He simply sat across from her, and for the first time since the church, the silence between them felt like something built rather than something endured. It was Lady Cornelia who insisted they return to London. You cannot let Pelham and that Ashdown woman spread their version of this uncontested, she said, with the flat certainty of a general assessing terrain. We will give society the true story before they can finish inventing a false one. A ball, my townhouse. I'll see it done within the fortnight, Julian argued. At first, the thought of the season's glittering machinery, of pitying glances he'd spent 2 years avoiding, plainly cost him something. I left that world because I couldn't bear its eyes on me, Aunt. You're asking me to walk back into the middle of it. I'm asking you to protect your wife's name with the only weapon you have left, which is your own. Lady Cornelia did not soften the words. You may hide from grief as long as you like, Julian. You may not hide from duty while it's actively burning down around someone else's head. He looked at Clara, and she said nothing, because she had learned by now that the choice had to be entirely his, or it would mean nothing at all. Very well, he said at last. London, then. The weeks before the ball rearranged something between them that neither named aloud. They spent evenings in his aunt's library, working through guest lists and gossip, and somewhere in the tedium of seating charts, he began, haltingly, to talk of Oxford, of the brother he'd lost, of a father who'd never once said a kind word that wasn't also a correction. Edmund wanted to be an astronomer, he said one night, watching the fire rather than her, not a duke. He used to say the stars didn't care what a man was born to. I think that's the last true thing I remember him saying to me, the week before the accident. I've never told anyone that. Clara set her hand, carefully, on his arm, the first time she had touched him without some practical reason to. He looked at her hand, and then at her face, something moving behind his eyes like weather changing. Julian, she said. It was the first time she'd used the name instead of any of the others he'd worn. Say it again, he said, low. Julian. He didn't kiss her, but he turned his hand under hers and held it, and that night, was somehow more than a kiss would have been. One evening, without explanation, Julian led her down a corridor she hadn't yet explored, to a door she'd assumed was simply locked against dust sheets like so many others in the house. He hesitated, with his hand on the latch, long enough that she nearly told him he needn't, and then opened it anyway. It was a boy's room, preserved exactly as it must have been left. A narrow bed, a battered globe, a wall of shelves crowded with fossils and birds' eggs, and a half-finished model of the solar system built from wire and painted wood. I haven't been in here since, Julian said, not needing to finish the sentence. I told myself it was because I couldn't bear it. I think, if I'm honest, it was because I was afraid that if I looked at it long enough, I'd have to admit how much I still wanted him to walk back in and finish that model himself. Clara moved to the shelf and touched, very lightly, the wire arm of an unfinished Saturn. He was building outward, she said. Sun, then the near planets, then further. He hadn't got past Jupiter. No. Julian's voice had gone rough. He never did. "Would you mind terribly," she said, "if I finished it? Not to replace anything, only so it isn't left forever half a thing." He was quiet for so long she thought she'd overstepped badly. Then, "I think," he said, "he would have liked that a great deal more than he'd have liked it left exactly as he abandoned it." He was never patient with unfinished work. A ghost of a smile. He'd have badgered you mercilessly about the proportions, though. He was very particular about the rings. "Then I shall have to get them right," Clara said, "or suffer the ghost of his disapproval." It was, she thought later, the first time she had heard him laugh, not the near smile she'd learned to watch for, but an actual low, surprised laugh, as though it had escaped before he could decide whether to permit it. She held on to the sound of it long after they'd left the room, and locked the door behind them, gently, not as a seal this time, but as a promise to come back. 2 nights later, at a modiste's fitting arranged by his aunt, Clara stood in a length of ivory silk and caught sight of herself in the glass, a duchess's shape, a stranger's face wearing her own eyes, and felt, for the first time since Candle Street, a flicker of genuine fear. What if they never stopped seeing the girl who married a beggar? She asked Lady Cornelia, who was pinning a hem with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had buried 3 husbands' worth of scandal in her time. "My dear," said Lady Cornelia, without looking up, "they will call you whatever serves their gossip best, today, tomorrow, and every day after. The only question that signifies is what you call yourself. Decide that first. The rest is merely noise." The night of the ball, Lady Cornelia's townhouse blazed with more candlelight than Clara had ever stood inside of. She wore the ivory silk with no ornament but a single strand of pearls, and when she descended the staircase on Julian's arm, the room's chatter thinned to a hush that felt, for one suspended moment, like falling. "Ready?" he murmured. "No," she admitted. "Are you?" "Not remotely." His hand tightened over hers. "But we'll do it together." They were 3/4 through the evening, the room's opinion of them visibly warming. She had remembered names, laughed at the right moments, let Julian's steady hand at the small of her back do the work her nerves could not. When the doors opened on Mrs. Ashdown and Lord Pelham, uninvited and unannounced, and the music guttered into silence behind them. "Clara," her mother's voice carried, pitched for the whole room. "Thank heaven, we've come to bring you home, away from this fraud." Pelham stepped forward, reaching for Clara's free arm, as though the matter were already settled. "The marriage will be annulled, Lady Clara. You were coerced by a common tradesman posing as—" "Unhand my wife." Julian's voice did not rise. It did not need to. It cut through the ballroom's silence like something with an edge. Pelham's hand stilled, then withdrew, his bravado failing in the face of an authority he suddenly understood had never actually left the man in front of him. "Tell them the truth, Clara," her mother said, quieter now, almost pleading. And for one instant, Clara saw beneath the fury to something smaller and more frightened than she had ever let herself notice before. "Tell them you were tricked. Come home." Every face in the room turned toward her. It was, Clara understood, the last door her mother would ever open for her back into the old life, and it was still, after everything, a door. She looked at her mother's face, twisted with a fear that had never once, in 23 years, made room for anyone but itself. She looked at Pelham's cold calculation, and then she looked at Julian, at the man who had kept a saucer of milk out for a cat that didn't trust him yet, who had knelt in gutter water for a stranger who couldn't repay him, who had opened a dead brother's observatory because she'd swept the dust from its floor, who had let her, slowly and against every instinct of self-protection he owned, all the way into the locked rooms of himself. She stepped away from her mother and looped her arm through her husband's. "You are mistaken, Mama," she said, and her voice did not shake. "This is my husband, Julian Ashford, Duke of Wrexham, and I have never in my life been more certain of anything than I am of him." The silence broke on a single sound, Lady Cornelia, beginning to applaud, slow and deliberate, until the room took it up around her like a wave finding its shape. Pelham was gone within the minute, swallowed by the crowd's shifting disapproval. Mrs. Ashdown stood alone at the center of it, a woman who had tried to sell a fear-shaped version of the future and lost to a truer one, and Clara felt, watching her mother's isolation, not triumph, but a strange and unexpected grief, for a woman who had never learned any currency but fear, and had just watched it fail her completely. Julian drew Clara toward the center of the floor as the musicians found their places again. "I love you," he said, quiet enough that it belonged only to her. "I think I have since you stood in my doorway, with £30 and more courage than sense." "I love you too," she said. "My Duke, my bookbinder, whichever you'd like to be tonight." "Both," he said. "I find I don't have to choose anymore." And then, at last, in the middle of 100 watching candles, he kissed her, unhurried, certain, a beginning rather than an ending, the way the best true things always are. Epilogue. The following spring, the observatory dome at Ashford Grange turned every clear night, and Julian had taught Clara to find Cassiopeia and the slow wheel of the plough before the frost came. The print shop on Candle Street still ran, under a manager Julian trusted and visited twice a month, because he'd found he could not entirely let go of a trade that had once let him disappear, and did not need to now, since he no longer wished to be anyone but himself. Mrs. Pearl had been brought north at Clara's insistence, installed as housekeeper at the Grange, where her opinions on the under-footman's posture were already the terror of the servants' hall. Meg came to stay every school holiday, and had taken with fierce enthusiasm to the telescope, badgering Julian with questions in a manner Lady Cornelia observed, dryly, was very much like listening to a ghost. Lady Cornelia visited often, pronounced herself insufferably right about everything, and was, on this point at least, entirely correct. Clara's mother did not visit. She had retreated to a small house in Bath after the ball, her name quietly withdrawn from society's better invitations, and Clara found she thought of her, when she thought of her at all, with something closer to pity than anger, a woman who had spent a whole life mistaking control for love, and lost the one chance she'd had to learn the difference. Once, in the autumn, a letter had come, brief and unsigned in anything but formality, asking after Clara's health and nothing else. Clara had answered it in kind, brief, civil, a door left very slightly ajar rather than either flung open or shut, and told herself that was likely as much healing as that particular wound would ever manage, and that it would have to be enough. The model of the solar system stood finished, at last, on a shelf in the observatory, rather than the boys' room it had been built in. Saturn's rings very slightly too wide, exactly as Edmund would have scolded her for. Julian had taken to bringing his correspondence up to the dome some evenings, working by lamplight while Clara read beside him, and more than once Lady Cornelia had remarked, with her usual dry precision, that she had never in her life seen a room used so thoroughly for two entirely different purposes at once, and somehow neither party minding. The apprentice from Candle Street, grown 2 years older and considerably less inclined to stare, had been apprenticed formally under the shop's new manager, and wrote to Julian twice a year with a diligence that suggested he still hadn't quite decided whether his old employer had been a duke playing at being a printer, or a printer who had briefly and inexplicably become a duke. Julian had never troubled to correct him either way. Some doors, he'd told Clara once, were better left standing slightly open than either locked or thrown wide. Clara stood on the terrace one evening in April, watching Julian teach the housekeeper's grandson to skip stones across the lake, and thought of a rainy street 2 years gone, a man kneeling for a stranger who couldn't repay him. "What are you thinking of?" Julian asked, coming up the lawn to join her. His sleeves rolled and his hands still damp from the water. "A man in the rain," she said, "who thought no one was watching." He took her hand. "Someone always is," he said. "I'm glad, in the end, that it was you." Behind them, the house stood with every window lit, and for the first time, in longer than either of them could easily remember, it did not look like a place holding its breath. It looked, simply, like a place where two people had decided, against every reasonable expectation, to stay. Later, after the boy had gone in for his supper, and the lake had gone still and silver under the last of the light, Julian drew her down onto the terrace steps beside him, in no particular hurry to go inside. "I used to think a name was a kind of prison," he said, turning the iron ring on her finger slowly between his fingers. She had never once asked to have it replaced, and he had never once offered, and both of them understood by now that this was its own kind of vow. Wrexham, winter, it hardly mattered which. "I thought the only freedom available to me was in disappearing entirely. And now? Now I think a name is only a prison if no one's chosen to stand inside it with you." He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth, briefly, to the plain iron band. "I would rather be a duke with you beside me than a free man alone in a print shop. I did not expect, 2 years ago, ever to be able to say that honestly." "You knelt for a stranger in the rain once," Clara said, "and thought no one had seen you do it." "I have thought since that it was the truest thing you ever did, truer than the title, truer than the name you hid behind. I did not marry a duke, Julian, and I did not marry a printer. I married the man who knelt." He didn't answer in words. He didn't need to. The house waited behind them, patient and lit, and finally, entirely, awake, and neither of them was in any hurry at all to go back inside it. Not tonight, with the stars coming out clean and cold over the lake, and Cassiopeia rising exactly where she'd learned to expect it, and nothing left between them that needed to be hidden from the light. No borrowed name, no locked door, no ledger of debts owed or paid, only the two of them and the house, and the wide, unhurried dark settling gently over all of it, like something finally, fully at rest.